Kathmandu. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So let's get started since we have quite limited time for a very ambitious topic. So we are going to talk in about next hour about the Humanitarian-Development Nexus with a link to disaster risk reduction and the potential as such for as a linking element. So indeed, it's really a broad topic for 1 hour. Let's see what we can share with you in such a short time. Just before getting started, thanks for unmuting your microphone, those who are not speaking at the moment, the non-presenters, and you will have the chance to make questions either in the text box or after the case study presentations. The webinar will last about 1 hour, and thereafter you will have access to the online version from the presentation. First of all, a few words to the Swiss NGO DRR Platform that is actually organizing this webinar. So this is a platform of about 70 Swiss-based NGOs, and we are working on the topic of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Our work is focused on 3 main pillars, and one of it is capacity building. So that's one of the reasons why we are doing this current webinar, but we are also organizing one-day training workshop, international face-to-face events, and so on. We are also working on the topic of technical advice through the elaboration of guidance and instruments. And then the last pillar refers to advocacy, which refers to our work in Switzerland as well as internationally. The Swiss NGO DRR Platform is co-founded by the NGOs and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and more related to our work, our events, and so on, you can see online on our website. That's also where you will have access to the presentation of this webinar. The webinar of today, we will have a short introduction, which includes also a poll, multiple choice question answer. I will introduce that in a moment. Then we will have conceptual input, and then 2 case studies from Nepal and Bangladesh, and we will wrap up with a short outlook then also. So for the moment being, you only hear my voice, but actually there is more other co-presenters and co-organizer in this call. You're going to listen in a moment to Jana Junghart from Caritas. She's going to make the introduction on the conceptual part. Then we'll have a case study presentation from Jane from Helvetas, Nepal, and she elaborated the case study together with her colleague Niraj Achaya, also from Helvetas, Nepal. And the second case study, we're going to listen to Sanjim Biswas from Swiss Red Cross in Bangladesh. And my name is Evelyn Studer. I'm working at Helvetas, Switzerland. The webinar objectives, as you could see from the invitation, it's really a short introduction into the topic of the Nexus, and Nexus always referring to development, humanitarian aid. And then a bit about the concept, the trends behind it, and through the case studies we'd like to share some experience with you. Short background to the topic, why we are talking about this today and here. So the members of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform, they're working in development as well as in humanitarian context. Therefore, it was kind of obvious that this is a topic that is been brought up in their institution as well as in their practical work. Therefore, the Swiss NGO DRR Platform chose the Nexus as one of 6 main topics we are going to work on in the upcoming 4 years. And that's one of these first activities we are working on now through this webinar. There was already a one-day learning event in March 2019, and part of the content that has been elaborated during that event will be shared now through the webinar. And the main event will then be in autumn this year, where we're going to organize a face-to-face event during about 2.5 years here in Switzerland, where all of you would be most welcome to join us and to exchange more in depth about the topic. Let's start with a very short poll on the Nexus topic, a little bit to better understand also what are your needs and what's your background of those participating now in the call. I would like to ask you to get ready with your cursors in order to answer the first question, which is about the institutional profile where you're working. Can you just indicate with the cursor you have the correct answer which corresponds to your institutional profile? So is your organization rather working in development or humanitarian aid? So please just click on the according reference you see there. So either you're working clearly in a development context, rather on a development context, in a mixed setup, or in humanitarian or purely humanitarian context. Sorry, so now it should be all possible to vote. I'll let you make your remarks there. I have a few answers only. I'll count to 3 until closing the poll. 1, 2, 3. Let's see. So we see for the moment being there's rather people working in mixed or development contexts. Let's then continue with the second questions. So totally going to be about 4 questions, which are really short. The second question then rather refers to your personal experience. So what your work referring to disaster risk reduction, is this rather in a humanitarian context or in a development context? Or if you're not working in on DRR explicitly, you can just refer generally to your work. I see it's also mixed. Let me count down from 3 until closing the poll. 3, 2, 1. Let's just save these results also. And the third question refers to the definition actually on the nexus. I know it has probably not been of a topic for all of you or your organization, or probably not yet. But do you know from your institution, do you have a clear definition on that in a sense of a double nexus, linkage between development and humanitarian aid, rather a triple nexus, which also includes the component of peace building? Or didn't you have yet started, or didn't you yet have a clear definition on that? So it seems to be it's mainly the double nexus, though also a bit of a mixed picture. Okay, thank you. And the last question, it refers rather to experience, exchange, mutual learning from practitioners of humanitarian aid context and development context. What would you say, according to your personal experience, what should be the kind of first priority in order to improve the nexus in praxis? Is it rather that practitioners from development context should prepare themselves better and their projects for humanitarian crisis emergency situation? Or is it rather the other way around, that humanitarian practitioners should improve? Or as I see so far, you don't see a priority, or actually see both as a priority? that seems so far quite balanced. Okay, let me close this poll and save this also. And with that, thanks a lot for your contribution to this poll. It was interesting to see. We will also reflect further on this topic, and we would allow ourselves after this webinar to share with you a more in-depth survey, also a bit to shape our work, and especially the more detailed workshop that we are going to plan to organize this autumn. With this, let's get started a bit with the conceptual background about the trends and the concepts and challenges related to the Nexus. I would therefore like to hand over to Jana, who will start with her presentation on this. Jana, are you ready to start?
Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me well. Can you see the presentation? I had to take over and share my screen. I hope this works. Very good morning from my end. I am Jana from Caritas Switzerland, knowledge manager for climate and disaster risk reduction, and would like to give you a very brief glimpse as an introduction to the Humanitarian Development Nexus, formerly also called or known as linking relief, rehabilitation and development. Okay, it seems that you can hear me well. That's good. I would like to structure the next 10 minutes according to a few questions. Why the Nexus? What is the Nexus? And how can we put the Nexus into practice? This should be a handing over then to the concrete case studies from Bangladesh and from Nepal, which I assume are also for most of you here of direct interest. So why? What are the objectives of the Nexus? Evelyn already mentioned, and I guess most of you are already familiar with the broad idea of the concept, which describes the relationships between the domains of humanitarian aid and development cooperation. The objective of the Nexus is basically to enhance the collaboration between humanitarian aid in the acute setting of a crisis or a disaster, and the handing over, linking and streamlining of work with the long-term development cooperation. This is with the objectives to increase synergies also between these fields, and we will see on a few slides later where entry points can be. This also has the objective, or furthermost, the objective of increasing the effectiveness of humanitarian aid and development cooperation, respectively, more broadly spoken, working in contexts of crisis. With, of course, the overall goal to strengthen the well-being and reduce vulnerability of risk, increase the resilience of the people that we work with. We have seen this graph already, so the Nexus as the overlapping area of humanitarian aid and development cooperation, which can be linked to institutional settings, which can be linked to chronological involvement, and which also links to certain topics. We will focus today mostly on DRR, but it is important to also keep in mind the so-called and already mentioned by Evelyn triple nexus, which would also include aspects and thinking on peace building into this equation. So while originally, and this is very this is formulated to the extreme now, of course, if you consider humanitarian aid traditionally really starting at the start of a crisis or at the once a disaster hits, and development assistance or development cooperation taking over once the crisis is over. This, on the one hand, is not what the nexus is about, and this is, on the other hand, not what the reality looks like. So why are we now looking at the idea of nexus, of how to link humanitarian aid with development cooperation now? The idea is not new. I will look at this in a few moments, but first let's start with the question, why now? As a background, the volume, the cost, and the length of humanitarian assistance over the past 10 years has grown dramatically. The Global Humanitarian Overview from 2019 states that the average length of crisis is nearing 10 years. So the original setup of the field of humanitarian aid and development cooperation seems not necessarily being fit for this purpose. Protracted crises that are complex, resource intense, as we are seeing since almost a decade in Syria and Yemen, for example, are becoming more and more relevant in the field, and more resource consuming, and making clearly defined humanitarian interventions, rehabilitation interventions, and then development cooperation taking over more and more obsolete. So in order to secure development holds in such settings, the sectors need to combine their efforts, and this is where the nexus and its implementation come into place. When we talk about nexus, we can, especially with a focus on DRR, it might look a bit different if we look more closely on the triple nexus. But related to the double nexus, I would like to highlight three aspects. So on the one hand, apply development principles early on in emergency settings. Then integrate prevention and preparedness elements in development cooperation. That is, in overall development projects and programs, be prepared for the case that a disaster might strike, be prepared for certain crisis development, and factor this into your planning and into your risk analysis. And as a third aspect, the so-called smooth transition from emergency aid and longer-term interventions on the ground that can include humanitarian resources, human resources that are well versed in humanitarian aid, know the context, but also can ensure a handing over to longer-term development cooperation. But it can also refer to programs more and more factoring in longer-term development cooperation. So the rehabilitation part in these three circles below. However, we have seen, or we are seeing in our practice, that the recovery and rehabilitation part, so really the linking part, is the one that is the most difficult to get funding for. Just very briefly, as I mentioned, that LRRD is a concept that is not new. So already in the 1980s, the approach of linking relief, rehabilitation, and development came up in the sense of a linear one-way transition. So to ease or to ensure a smooth handing over from a humanitarian intervention to longer-term development programming, which was in the 1990s and early 2000s, took a shift from the continuum approach, so really the consequent and moving from humanitarian aid to development cooperation to a so-called contiguum approach, where the simultaneous application or the working in different ways in different areas at the same time. So while in one place you would still focus on recovery and on rehabilitation of livelihoods in other areas, geographical areas, but also sectors, you might be already back on track when working, back on track in setting up longer-term development projects. The last decade with the SDGs and the linked Agenda 2013 has seen a shift to looking at different sectors and different themes in a more connected way. This is where the topic or the term of nexus, which by now has been applied in various thematic areas, so where the term of nexus came up, and the focus on resilience. So the ability of people to absorb shocks, to adapt to stresses, and to transform under also challenging conditions. This being said, almost 30 years of this LRRD approach, the Nexus concept, this has led to substantial change in programs and projects. But overall, if we look at the sectors of humanitarian aid, or if we look at the sector of development cooperation, we still find large gaps in organizational structures, in funding of programs, but also in overarching programs. And we will now see in the case studies how on the ground really linking humanitarian interventions, humanitarian aid, and longer-term development cooperation would work. So the examples will follow. I will hand over to, I think, Nepal. But let me just highlight three entry points, which would be through the institutional structure. So not going via humanitarian aid departments in one country and have at the same time desks for development cooperation, but trying really to channel interventions through one person. This would also help to break down the silos that even within our organizations may still exist, as well as working with permeable structures that can be like an emergency pool where staff is able to usually perform in a development programs and project, but once an emergency strikes, is well acquainted with the context and can also act in crisis context. This can also relate to program and project planning. I was already mentioning that including preparedness and development projects, trying to introduce sustainability aspects in humanitarian aid projects. So, for example, when it comes to natural resource use, when it comes to strengthening local structures from the very beginning, this is all linked to a swift handing over to development or to to a setting where longer term projects can already or can again be implemented, or even not come from different perspectives, so from a development perspective and from a humanitarian perspective, but to work on integrated programs. As well, the implementation, and I think that Jane will say a few words about this related to Nepal. So share resources also between organizations, collaborate between organizations that have more a humanitarian focus and organizations that have a long-term standing already in the country context, to really make ideal use of synergies and resources. There are a number of challenges. I mentioned them already. The institutional gap between organizations, more humanitarian or more development organizations, but even within organizations, a funding gap where especially the recovery phases are particularly difficult to fund, and the lack of flexibility in funding arrangements, and clear funding streams that only are applicable for humanitarian or for development cooperation. Yes, partnerships and coordinations are also still a major challenge, since us tend to have a tendency in specialization, either in humanitarian aid or development cooperation. But I will end with the challenges, but will also now hand over to Nepal, where they talk about their experience and will give you first-hand insights on also solutions how to overcome these challenges. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jana, for your introduction here. Of course, it's a bit of conceptual, as mentioned, but of course that's also what many people and institutions are talking about on the Nexus. It's rather on this conceptual part, and what we are missing often, and what we are really looking for, is to have kind of concrete examples and case studies. So that's why I'd like now to invite our colleagues Jane and Sanjeev for a presentation of their mutual case studies, which are in both, as said, in Asian context, though still in a rather different context when it comes to the country, the hazard situation, but also the socio-political context. We're going to listen from a case study from Helvetas, Nepal. So Helvetas rather with a development background as an institution, originally at least, and also the Swiss Red Cross, which rather, I would say, comes from a humanitarian context, but also has shifted and has integrated since then elements from a development context. So I would like to ask then Jane to get started with the first case study, and we will have at the very end a short moment also for questions and comments. I see there's already some comments in the text box. We reconsider them. Okay,
Jane. Well, good morning to you in Switzerland or Europe, and it's afternoon already here in Kathmandu. Evelyn, I've requested control. I don't know. I've got my presentation on my screen. Can you see it?
Can you share your desktop probably in the third icon below? Otherwise, I will do it for you. We don't see it at the moment.
Okay, can you do it?
Yes.
Because I've already...
One second. So... Okay.
Can you see it now?
Now is it visible?
I mean, on my screen, I'm switching between the two, but on my screen it's just showing loading rather slowly.
Yeah, but now you should see the screen of the presentation. Is that correct? Everyone sees the presentation?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, well, let me start then. As Evelyn's already mentioned, Helvetas Nepal is very much a development organization. We've been here present in Nepal for 64 years now, so with a strong reputation in the development sector. When the earthquake happened, it wasn't a surprise. I mean, it was known that, of course, we're in the Himalayas, it is an earthquake-prone area, but of course nobody knows when an earthquake is going to happen. And a lot of humanitarian organizations arrived. The government was quite overwhelmed at the beginning and very much wanted to have control over what was going on, which is perfectly fair enough. It's not a conflict or crisis situation. Well, it's not a government's crisis situation, so it was natural that the government did want to see what was going on with all these organizations arriving. So that was a little bit of a tension of humanitarian organizations wanting to come in and do things immediately versus government wanting to know what they were going to do, where they were going to be, how much money they were spending, etc. That was a situation we've had to work with all along the way. But if I go through the different aspects that we worked on or the different projects that we got, obviously in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, there was a sort of 3-month emergency period when we were also very much engaged in simply getting emergency relief to the different areas which were badly affected. And in that we coordinated with the government and we chose to work in one particular area, which is what was then the district of Sindhu Palchok, and 2 particular what are now municipalities, which are called Melamchi and Helambu. And after the 3 months of sort of immediate emergency relief, we got going in actual projects. So you have here on the screen, I hope, a list of the different projects in which we were engaged. We worked on skills training of masons and to a lesser extent carpenters so that they learned earthquake resilient construction. There, first of all, STC had a project. We still have an ongoing project actually with STC on that. DFID then joined in a little bit later on in 2016. It was building on already a project that we had before, which was very much, it's called Employment Fund. So this was Employment Fund for Skills for Reconstruction. We developed a 50-day training program whereby private training providers were doing the training, and it's a results-based payment scheme. So the private service providers providing this training only got paid the final tranche once people had been employed in their chosen discipline, in this case in construction, for 6 months afterwards. And they got, all those who graduated got government recognized certificate. It's level 1 in the technical scheme of things. Then we worked on shelter with Solidar Swiss, with Swiss Solidarity funding, also WASH, again with Swiss Solidarity funding. We worked also on supporting agricultural livelihoods, and then we also worked with Caritas, which had a large program of rebuilding schools which had been affected by the disaster. So they built 36 schools, and we did the WASH component of all those schools. In addition, we had another project which was rehabilitating coffee processing centres. Now, we had a long-term project supporting the coffee sector, and a whole group of different producers organised into cooperatives. So those cooperatives had processing centres before the earthquake, many of which were destroyed. So we worked on rehabilitating and building back those processing centres. There's 14 of them in total. So if you look at all those different projects, you'll see that the majority were, well, they were basically Swiss funded, with the exception of DFID. And we had this strong collaboration with Swiss Solidarity in terms of the funding, so that's Schendebonner Glückskette. And we worked very closely with 2 Swiss organizations which was more specialized than us in humanitarian, so that's Swiss Solidarity and Caritas. And we found that those relationships, we looked at working with other organizations, but it was those Swiss collaborations which actually really worked, and where we got in the funds and were able to work together, really on the whole very successfully. As an aside, I would say there are always sort of differences of perspective between a development organization and a humanitarian organization, but I think on the whole we managed them quite nicely, or at least we talked about things where we saw that there were differences of opinion. There are many, many different lessons that one could draw out from the experience of the response to the earthquake, but I've pulled out 3 here that in discussion with Evelyn we thought were particularly relevant for the DRR aspects. So the first of those is the need to target judiciously. Reaching the most disadvantaged and vulnerable is not easy. It requires contextual knowledge and additional resources. Then use the opportunities that you have in a sort of humanitarian development nexus situation to work for positive social change. And then the other one is work with local institutions as far as possible, because that is where you can foster sustainability. So I'll go through those one by one. As far as appropriate or judicious targeting is concerned, it's a clear need to have criteria which are clear to everybody, unambiguous in your targeting process. You cannot get away from targeting. The needs are always so great, and so you need to look at where you're going to work, who you're going to work with. And there, understanding the pre-disaster social context is really important, or that's what we found. So it was much easier for us to know where to target in terms of geographically the areas which were the most in need. So when I said that we worked in Helambu and in Melamchi, I mean, even there we worked in certain particular clusters because we recognized that the need there was greatest. And also just knowing the social background. I've noted here that managing the potential tension between government and local definitions of vulnerability was an issue. The government was a little bit slow in identifying the fact that there were particularly vulnerable people who would find it most difficult to get assistance, but they did eventually come out with a list of vulnerable households. And their criteria for vulnerable households were basically older people over 65, widows, orphans, disabled people, which is fine, but it doesn't take into, it's a very non-political definition, and it doesn't take into account those more sort of social nuances. Yeah, Nepal is actually a very sort of socially hierarchical society, even today, less than it was, but still there are very clear social hierarchies, which means that the Dalits, who in the past would have been called untouchable, are much more disadvantaged, as are the Janajatis, the indigenous peoples. So they were actually the people who were more likely to be at risk and who we tried to work with most. And I'll just give you an example of targeting. Now, under the government scheme, a woman over 65 living on her own was disadvantaged and therefore should have priority. Now, in going to the field, I, for example, met one woman who had had a lot of support in rebuilding her house, and she was indeed over 65 and she was living on her own, but she proudly showed me her American passport, her Nepali passport sent to her by her son in arranged for her by her son in America, who had then invited her to America after the disaster, and she had the stamp in her passport showing that she had been to America. So she was really not one of the most disadvantaged, but she had had all the support because she fulfilled those sort of narrow government criteria. Whereas I said, for us, looking at sort of a little bit more of a broad definition of who was disadvantaged was really important, and understanding that, and understanding what really the more disadvantaged needed. And there you need additional resources. You need additional financial resources just for getting to the more remote places. The people who were particularly disadvantaged often couldn't work themselves. They needed additional support in labour, but they often, and most particularly, needed social support. For the government, instigated a scheme whereby everybody who had lost a house and who was on the register was eligible to get what was 3 lakh, that's 300,000 rupees compensation. But this was paid in tranches. There were 3 tranches. So you had to start building your house to get a second tranche. And to actually be able to claim this money, you had to have a bank account, you had to have papers, you had to go to the district office. It was very difficult for the more vulnerable people. So there, actually, we had to give a lot of additional support. So we had people on site who were going regularly to meet these more disadvantaged people and helping them fill in the papers, taking their papers to the government offices, etc. And otherwise, they would never have got the grant from the government. Associated with that was that quite a few people got into a debt trap because they took a loan to rebuild their house, and loans in rural Nepal can be extremely expensive. It's quite usual for moneylenders to lend money at the rate of 2 or 3% per month, so that's 24 or 36% per annum. And then obviously if the rebuilding of your house is delayed, you get into more and more debt. So this was often a big issue. And I would argue this is very much linked to building resilience if you're actually in the process of recovering from a disaster such as this, and you're actually having your livelihood eroded. This is going to make you much, much more non-resilient in future. So this really has to be thought about as to how to support the most vulnerable, that they don't get into worse situations. So that was my first point. Second point, using opportunities of reconstruction, of working at this humanitarian development nexus to build for positive social change. And there we had examples in building gender responsiveness. For example, we introduced a system, well, we didn't introduce it, but we introduced support for a system of joint land ownership, whereby in most parts of Nepal, houses and land are owned by men. The certificates, the land certificates, the house certificates are in the name of the man only. So working with a local NGO partner, we had camps whereby we brought government officers to camps in the earthquake-affected areas, so that if people wanted to come forward and sign the papers in the joint name of the husband and the wife, they could do so on site. And that resulted in a lot of the people who we supported in rebuilding their houses to actually going for these joint land ownership certificates. And there you have a gentleman holding up the certificate with his wife and their grandchild. In all the trainings that we did, we also had quotas for women. Another thing was we tried to avoid replicating negative gender stereotypical practices. And example of this is that quite a few humanitarian organizations learned that menstruation is something which is considered polluting in Nepal, and that therefore it might be a good idea to have a separate place for menstruating women in the areas where there was sort of temporary construction of shelters, that you would have an area for menstruating women to go to. But from our perspective, this was absolutely a negative thing to do, because it's reinforcing this whole concept that you are polluting during your menstrual period, and that actually we should not be trying to reinforce this. We should be trying to break down such outmoded practices. Then another point was just in considering holistic post-disaster needs. I've already touched upon that in reaching the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged. But basically, if you've lost your house and your livelihood is not enough to have a shelter, you also need a lot more support. So the skills training that we did was one. This 50-day training in earthquake resilient construction was intended to give people a skill that they could use then in other areas as well, and go on to be masons or carpenters working in other places, not just earthquake affected areas necessarily in the future. We also did farmer training, and particularly because we worked on small-scale irrigation, building back the small-scale channels which had been been destroyed in the earthquake. So then we linked that to working on agriculture improvements, so further agriculture extension activities, as well as farmer-to-farmer business schools, which is the farmer-to-farmer business school model is one which we had already developed in other situations, completely development situations. So we introduced this to the area so that farmers growing perhaps new crops, more vegetables actually, could then market them in an efficient and effective way. Then as far as agricultural support was concerned, I mentioned the irrigation channels and agricultural inputs. We also worked on improved water mills. There in rural areas of Nepal, foodstuffs are still preferred to be ground on traditional water mills. So we introduced improved water mills which were more energy efficient. So these are all sort of examples of where we tried to build in a real development perspective into, which was also for social change in the activities that we did. Oops. Then the third point that I wanted to raise was the one of working with local institutions. Now, the fact that we had been present in Nepal for a long time meant that we already knew quite a lot of local partners. So we worked through true trusted local NGOs, and we worked with farmer cooperatives as well. And we also built their awareness on disaster resilience and how to be more responsive in the future. We worked with and built, where necessary, community-based institutions. So in the water, both drinking water schemes and in the irrigation schemes, we had user groups and user committees. So there, we formed those committees for the water schemes that we devised. That's a technique which we use in all our water schemes, but we also built in their ideas about resilience, and we also had techniques for making the structures much more resilient in future. So, for example, we had reinforced water tanks and intake tanks. And we tried to really build in with the committees their quick responses. So if they knew if there was if a disaster took place, what they could do rapidly. We also worked with school management committees and the same thing. I mean, that's more with Caritas, but we worked with, because it was Caritas which was building the schools, but we worked on the WASH side of the schools and worked on WASH aspects with the school management committees. And then farmer groups, well, I've mentioned farmer groups in the context of the farmer business schools, etc. It was also very important for us to maintain and build strong relationships with the government. I know that from a humanitarian perspective, sometimes it's more important just to sort of reach the affected people and try not necessarily to go through all the government structures. But there for us, it was very important to work both with the National Reconstruction Authority, which was set up after the disaster, and most especially with the local administrations. We had a change of local administration during the time of our work. At the beginning, there were districts and district disaster committees. Then, with federalization being introduced to Nepal in 2017, we had local municipalities taking over. So they're new organizations, and there we worked with them to plan in a disaster risk resilient way, and also to come up with local disaster management committees which would make plans. So those are now in both Melamchi and Helambu. They have these committees and they're working on their plans. I think I've run through that very sort of quickly. There are a lot of more things that I could say, but well, there we are. There's only 15 minutes. So for us, what was really important was the building back better, both from a social perspective and from the actual physical perspective of the structures that we left behind.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. I think that was really a bit the background, as you could see from Helvetas as a development institution that got started in this emergency situation in Nepal through the implementation of somehow interventions, approaches and tools that worked out in a development context from earlier projects, but they had to be adjusted in this emergency context. And similarly also DRR was probably not an explicit component, but still it has been integrated, especially through these important collaboration partnerships and also the consideration of disaster risk beyond the emergency situation and the rehabilitation also in a sense of disaster resilient rehabilitation. Okay, with that I would like to hand over to Sanjib, who was going to share us the presentation and the experience from Swiss Red Cross in Bangladesh. So Sanjib, can you just share your screen or shall I show it?
I can share my screen, no problem.
Okay, you can just take over as a presenter. For the moment we don't see it yet. The screen, let's see.
Can you
All
see
right,
it?
great. It's yeah.
Okay, thank you. As the previous presentation was explaining, like Swiss Red Cross is basically started its journey in Bangladesh with its humanitarian operations, but slowly, gradually, it is moving to the development direction. And while moving to that particular direction, I think resilience has become a key component, or resilience has become a key arena where we wanted to look. Before that, Bangladesh is a kind of a country where, except snowfall, volcanic eruption, and desert storm, you will find all sorts of disasters. So, by somehow the learning of us is like the relationship between development and the humanitarian aid was there among the mind of the people, among the knowledge of the people, and their practice level also. So here is a glimpse of the current programs of Swiss Red Cross Bangladesh. Like you can see, we are focusing on different issues like disaster risk management, health improvement, unit development, unit kind of a branch development of the national society, that means Red Cross Red Crescent National Society, then urban empowerment and resilience project. The bottom line is that for each and every project, we basically took the resilience framework and we tried to support the community people so that they can be more resilient, and by that exercise they can sort out different problems of the community. And we found that while doing this process also helps them to combat against any sorts of emergency situation. And I am going to provide you a clear example from a project which is implementing right at this moment in one of the districts of Bangladesh called Gaibandha. And this current project started from like June 2018, and in last year, that means in 2019, we had a emergency situation, like the flood was there. So this example will basically clearly give us an idea about the relationship between the relief, recovery, and development. For example, with the community people, the project and the local government developed the risk reduction action plan and the contingency plans. And when the emergency situation arrived in 2019, we found that as they were using these contingency plans, it was very easy for them to take any kind of decisions for mobilizing themselves. For example, who should go for immediate rescue, who should go for disseminating the early warning messages, kind of stuff. And also the risk reduction action plan gave the leverage to the community people to identify the kind of structures or kind of setup where they can take shelter during that particular flood situation. The project also supported the mitigation options with the community and with the local government institutions. And I should mention that because of our good example, for each and every mitigation activities is co-contributed or co-financed. Like we provide a certain amount of money, community people provide certain amount of money, and the local government institutions, that means the government, the lowest tier, is also providing certain amount of money to implement those mitigation options. And after completing this mitigation option, or after completing some of those mitigation options during the last flood, we found that people are able to take shelters in those roads, school planes which are raised by this particular project. Yeah, their mobility was much more higher because the roads were safe. So they got the real time of type of benefit during that emergency situation. Then this project was also contributing in terms of capacity building of our local government structures. Obviously, this is government structures, and in Bangladesh we have union disaster management committees, Upazila disaster management committees, and to strengthen the process, we also developed village development, village disaster management committees. And the project was providing different trainings, starting from early warning system, about resilience, about lots of issues which could be used for addressing the disaster situation. And after those flood, or during those flood, we found that as those UDMCs and UZDMCs, that means the union level and Upazila level disaster management committees, were trained, it was very easy for us to mobilize themselves, and they were taking actions for supporting the community people. And last but not the least, like the village level development committee also mobilized some funds, and those funds were used in other emergency situations where the local government or the other stakeholders are not playing that much role. For example, in cold wave situation where the local government was not playing role, or big organizations, development partners are not supporting, it was the village development committee who was there. And one of the good examples was about this forecast-based financing, like people were able to move timely from the disaster situation, and that reduced a lot of loss to the community people. And now I would very briefly, I would like to draw the attention related to development to relief recovery, or relief recovery to development. Like we are, when this emergency was happening in last year, that we are providing cash support, providing seed support, and we are providing some more support. So we found that with that cash, whatever cash we are providing to the community, it was basically helping them to restore their capacities, to restore the market system, and also through the seed support, the livestock support, the livelihood options were restored. The kitchen gardening has increased a lot of it, and their distress selling has stopped, so they can they were able to prevent some financial losses also. And we had a concept of covering all the beneficiaries under the sanitation sanitation coverage. We call this universal sanitation coverage. So this providing the wash support helped the community to achieve that target. Basically, that means to have this universal sanitation coverage. So the key messages or the learning is that DRR pays off. So if we invest in the normal period, if we work in the normal period in terms of reducing the disaster risks, that helps a lot. And 2019 flood is a classic example for that. And the second thing is we have to work with existing structures. That means the local government institutions, like we, the development practitioners are now facing a problem or now facing a challenge, like the amount of disaster and the extent of disaster is so high, and we, the development organizations, are covering so many less people in terms of emergency response. So how we can basically scale it up. So then we are thinking about using social safety net mechanism, other mechanisms, but the key learning is that we have to work with these existing structures and we have to strengthen the existing structures. Thanks to all.
Okay, Sanjeev, thanks a lot for your sharing your experience in Bangladesh. So showing really that we have to think also at the institutional as well as at the project level. And I think you have lots of specific DRR elements in it that show somehow in this emergency situation as actually how these are of use for the quality of our work. So actually considering time, I've seen that there has been quite a lot of answers and rather questions, comments and answer in the text box. I actually invite you all to have a look at this also, which is quite interesting. So in terms of the nexus, I think through the case study, what they really showed is that it's really crucial to consider a bit this longer time frame, not just these emergency situations, but rather to have a perspective and also a knowledge of pre-disaster time and also thinking about a longer period. That is something that helps us really to build up the nexus. And same on the other hand, that also if we are working in a development context, we also still have to think to get prepared also in order to be able to respond to an emergency or a crisis if something is going to happen. So there I think both again at the institutional as well as the level of our projects and program, it's important to always think about both context, emergency and development in order to really help our work to be more efficient and more connected in these both situations. Before actually just closing down, I think we don't really have to go too much time to go into specific questions related to the case studies, but is there any general comment someone would like to share with regards to what has been presented? As said, we can also later, through the presentation that is going to be online, we can also share then the contacts with the case study presenters in case there is some specific question there. And as I mentioned earlier, I would really be happy to see some of you during our face-to-face event that is going to happen in October, where we really will have more time to go more into depth with regards to this topic, and you will get further information later on. Let me here just mention briefly a bit the upcoming events from the Swiss NGO DRR platform. We plan to actually do a similar webinar, but then with a focus rather on Latin America and on Africa. Both are going to happen in spring, so somewhere in March or April. You will find updates on our website. As mentioned, there is this face-to-face workshop in autumn. as well, further information will be online, and we would also send you further information by email as we have your contacts. And also on the website, you will see further other one-day training events that are going to happen in Switzerland, and webinars which are planned throughout this year and also the upcoming years. And as mentioned earlier, this presentation will be online soon after. You can download it, the presentation, and through our YouTube channel, it should also be, the whole recorded webinar should be available. So would be great for those who haven't yet indicated your name and contact in the text box, just to write it down. Then we have a list and overview of all the participants, and would be great also if you could fill out a short, it's really a very short survey with regards to the quality of this webinar, which really helps us also to improve our work and for further webinars to have our lessons learned. So many thanks to all of you, and wish you a very nice weekend, and hope to meet you again virtually or personally in one of our events of the Swiss NGO DRR platform. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.